but that's what happens when you have an element that's an entire row lower on the periodic table. And the ore is just as weirdly heavy. Anyway, we got our metal melting furnace set up again, and then slowly fed in the copper. This took a few rounds of shoving it in, letting it melt, and then adding more. Once the fire added liquefied, scooped off any slag, and nugget. We gave the element to dissolve, then and poured out directly into a preheated mold. After quenching some water to quickly cool it off, because we're wildly impatient, we were left with some stunningly beautiful golden bars. These ingots can either be cold worked or melt and cast in whatever shape you want. And the best part is that now that the alloy is made, its melting point is even lower, so an even colder fire can be used to work with it. Now, you can't quench harden bronze the way that you do with iron. Even if you try, the material doesn't harden. However, you can work harden many copper alloys, bronze included. This means that when you whack a bit of bronze, it literally stiffens, and if you do that to the edges, you can end up with a surface that stays sharp much longer. But during the Bronze Age, there was actually another kind of bronze that used a different mineral, and the resulting alloy cooled to a beautiful silver color. That mineral was one of several ores of arsenic. This gives what was called arsenical bronze, and while the process of making it was extremely toxic, the end result was a bronze that was even harder and stronger and perfect for toolmaking. While this may seem insane to a modern viewer that knows just how toxic arsenic is, in the past, humans used arsenic for all kinds of stuff. Some arsenic ores are very brightly colored and come in shades of red, yellow, and orange. The red-orange one was called realgar, and the more yellow one was orpiment. And at least some viewers that watch the Apothecary Diaries just had their ears perk up. In the past, arsenic ore was used for paint, wallpaper, and makeup, and even today there is still a custom of adding some to wine in China for certain festivals. It also used to be sprinkled around the house to repel animals or insects, which is a very classic human thing. Take poison, spread it everywhere, and then make a surprise Pikachu face when it inevitably makes you sick.
Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!
But the point is that arsenical bronze was actually usually discovered first, because people already had a reason to collect arsenic. And more than that, arsenic ores tend to co-occur with copper ores, and some copper ores are literally just a 50-50 mix of arsenic and copper. So much so that even modern copper smelters have to have significant systems in place to capture and remove all of that arsenic rather than release it into the environment. The thing is, humans aren't stupid. They realized that the process was dangerous, but arsenical bronze had some very real advantages. For only a comparatively small amount of arsenic, you get a very strong alloy. You need far more tin by weight to achieve the same strength. So 2% arsenic was as good as 7 or 8% tin. And arsenic is relatively common, making it much easier to get in the sort of bulk that you need for smelting. However, once larger tin deposits were found and bronze with closer to 10 or 15% became reasonable to produce, arsenic was phased out. There is an old myth of the lame smith, as in a smith that can't walk. Hephaestus, the Greek smith god, for example, is usually portrayed as unable to walk properly. A huge part of this myth is because of arsenical bronze. When you spend years working with it, the poison seeps into you and slowly destroys your body, leaving you unable to walk and eventually gives you cancer or worse. Since I value being able to walk, and especially because I like my blood as about cancer-free as is reasonable, bronze, but know that it is comparable to the very high tin bronze that we've made. For the rest of our tools, it's time to do some casting. We took some of our homemade bronze as well as more copper and cast a pair of chisels to test out on rocks in a moment. The bronze one does need to avoid it being brittle. Bring it just to the point that it starts to darken. If you go to a red heat, it's too hot and then becomes brittle. Then the working edge of both chisels could be hammered to work harden them. These are now ready for use. One last note is that bronze is also very weather resistant. Copper alloys in general are pretty weather resistant, but bronze is a step above. This is why we tend to make statues and boat parts out of it. It's also why we find bronze artifacts mostly intact, whereas iron items like armor or swords tend to rust away to nothing if not carefully cared for. By far my favorite example of this is the Antikythera mechanism. It's the oldest known mechanical computer, made of dozens of tiny, intricate parts and gears, and it was found at the bottom of the ocean in a shipwreck. It had sat in the ocean for more than 2,000 years, yet remained partly intact. Sure, it's not in the best condition, but that's more than I can say for literally any piece of iron left in the same circumstances. Even in its ruined state, enough detail was preserved that working replicas of the mechanism have been made. And on the amazing channel ClickSpring, he's making as close to a perfect copy as possible, using only the tools that would have been available at the time. And I have spent many hours watching every second of those videos twice. Cannot recommend them enough. Moving on. Truly, the only reason that bronze was phased out is that it's much more expensive than iron, because both copper and tin are relatively rare on Earth, whereas iron can be found basically everywhere in huge quantity. To put some numbers to it, in Earth's crust, copper exists at about 50 parts per million, tin at about 2 parts per million, whereas iron comes in at a nice round 50,000. And this is why we eventually switched to iron. Anyway, now that we have some tools to work with, let's move on to cutting some rocks. As I said, the simplest way to do this is by just bashing two rocks together. But with arsenical or tin bronze, it was easy enough to make chisels, axes, adze, and more for precise cutting. Not to mention saws for cutting soft things like wood. We picked up a variety of the sorts of rock types that were used by the ancients to see what it would take to work with each. The softest is alabaster, which is a magnesium-based mineral, and is soft enough that you can scratch it with your fingernail if you push hard enough. Unsurprisingly, both copper and bronze chisels cut it, and we even fashioned a simple D-bit out of brass and were able to drill right through it. So you can understand why even modern sculptors like this stuff. It's incredibly easy to shape, and it was valued highly by the ancients for making all kinds of complex objects. Moving up in difficulty, we have limestone. This is a sedimentary form of calcium carbonate and is usually thousands of incredibly thin layers of sediment that have been squished together with time and pressure. Even copper was able to bite into this, and our copper chisel was plenty capable of shaping it, albeit slowly. Bronze, though, fared much better and cut it with ease, almost as well as a modern steel chisel. Now we start to get into the really hard stuff: marble and travertine. These are both metamorphic rocks, where limestone was dissolved and then reformed into a denser form elsewhere. The white marble is a little bit harder than the travertine and also has far fewer voids. At this point, the copper chisel starts to have some real trouble. It starts to deform and leave metallic streaks behind rather than really cutting. Bronze fared much better. Marble, it was capable of doing some damage, but the lack of voids meant that it was harder to get a good grip and bite into the rock. Comparing this to modern steel, which cuts marble with ease, does show the limits of bronze. Finally, we have granite. This stuff is so hard that the copper and bronze chisels left bright streaks of metal, and the rock was otherwise unaffected.
Now, if you ever hit me and I find out about it.
Even a modern steel chisel couldn't really do much and was leaving metal behind. But don't forget rule number 1. You only need a harder rock. Granite is mainly quartz, which means it's got a hardness of 6 or 7 on the Mohs scale, so we need something harder. Diamond, of course, would work, but a far cheaper and more abundant option is ruby, or rather corundum, which is the low-grade version and far less pretty, but just as hard. Corundum is just aluminum oxide, so it's relatively abundant on Earth, and it's the main thing that we use as a grinding abrasive even today. So this chunk of ruby I have absolutely cuts the granite without much fuss, and we'll see just how amazing powdered corundum is in just a moment. Now, assuming that you didn't just find a chunk of conveniently sized rock laying around, you're going to need to quarry it. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that this means that you need to cut blocks of stone out of the ground, but in reality, quarrying involves very little cutting and actually much more cracking. Unlike metal, rocks are highly granular and brittle, and many have distinct directions that they'll preferentially break in, sort of like how wood has grain. It's easy to split wood along the grain, but difficult in other directions. Similarly, it's easy to split rock along the so-called grain boundaries, and even massive boulders can be neatly split apart using only a few wedges and strategically placed holes. The wedges are driven into the holes to apply pressure along the whole length of the rock, and are tapped in bit by bit until the whole rock suddenly breaks. These days, that means metal wedges, but historically that wasn't even necessary. The Egyptians were known to use wooden wedges, and then make them expand by adding boiling water rather than just smacking them, though copper or bronze wedges would work just as well as any steel wedge. No matter the case, not only does this break the rock into more manageable chunks, it often leaves a relatively flat surface, or at least one that doesn't require much more work to make it flat. And we'll come back to how the Egyptians and others managed to produce incredibly flat surfaces we find in just a moment. Before that, how do you actually drill those initial holes to put the wedge in? Well, the simplest method is with a chisel. Bash away at the rock with a hard pointy thing, and you can eventually make a usable hole. This is very similar to how a modern rock drill works. It's more punching the rock than cutting it per se, but without modern power tools, these holes are rather rough and are never perfectly circular, and getting a lot of depth or concentricity is really hard. But the ancients had a much more clever and precise way to make holes. All throughout Egyptian architecture and decoration, we see a huge amount of extremely round, deep holes. Ones that are clearly drilled out rather than carved with a chisel. The conspiracy nutters like to point to these as evidence of aliens or lasers or nonsense, but the reality is both cooler and very simple. Not only did the Egyptians literally leave us pictures depicting how they drilled holes, we also have a large number of unfinished holes that show snapshots of what the process looked like. To get started, you need a round tube. This could absolutely be made out of wood or bone, but most often was either copper or bronze because they're going to wear down more slowly. This was attached to a bit of wood that was sometimes carved to have a handle that was offset from the shaft. This allows the user to crank the stick and make it behave like a drill. Though there are also many depictions of bow drills being used, and there were very likely pump drills used as well, depending on the size of the hole that you're cutting. Different practitioners almost certainly would have had different preferences for how they provided power to their drills. But at the end of the day, you make the round thing go spinny spin. Again, this is not rocket science. For our tests, we whipped up a quick pump drill, and I made the end have a slot to allow me to easily change out bits for different sized holes. For example, here's a very fine D bit made out of brass. Within maybe about 30 or 40 seconds, I can easily and quickly cut through a piece of wood. And for soft stone, the results are great as well. It's perfect for making beads or making the eyes on a sculpture. But wood or bone or even bronze won't cut hard rock on its own, nor was that the intention. Instead, to complete the drill, a slurry of hard grit, either silica sand or ideally corundum, mixed with either oil or water was put between the rock surface and the drill head. The drill head is made to stay in place using some sort of guide until the hole is established enough to self-guide. Here we're using a board with a hole drilled out, but a few bits of bamboo or other sticks would have worked just as well. The slurry needs to be topped up regularly, and you can actually hear when the slurry is depleted, so it's really easy to know when to add more. All we do now is crank away like a horny teen that found Grandpa's special milk crate of magazines in the garage. Is this a lot of effort? Yes, absolutely yes. Does it drill quickly? I mean, it's slower than a modern drill, but if you're not in a rush, within a pretty short time you can make a lot of progress. And by varying the diameter of the tube you use, you can control the size of the hole you drill very carefully. As this cuts, rather than an empty hole like you might expect from a modern twist drill bit, you're left with a deep ring carved into the stone and a central core that remains. This core would be broken by inserting a wedge into the ring to make the core snap out. And with this being the main way that they drilled holes, sure enough we find discarded cores like this all over Egypt. Because of the nature of this tool, it tends to wobble a lot more at the start of the cut, but becomes more concentric as you work. So holes always had a very slight taper to them and were a bit wider at the top than the bottom. We tested this on all of our different rock types, and we're honestly pretty amazed at how well this worked. Limestone, being the softest, cut the fastest, and half an hour of drilling got us about 3/4 of an inch into the rock. Travertine is a bit harder, so it was a bit slower, but not by much. By the time we got to proper marble, it did take a solid 45 minutes of drilling to cut through a half-inch slab. And finally, the granite was brutal. 20 minutes of drilling barely got a few millimeters deep. Enough that the cut was started, but it was noticeably slower. For all of these tests, we experimented with different drill types, and while a bow drill works perfectly fine, it is brutally exhausting compared to the pump drill. The pump drill was so smooth and easy that a single person could comfortably drill for extended periods of 20 or more minutes. Also, all of this made it very clear that this must have been a group activity in the past. I don't care how buff you are, powering a bow drill for long enough to dig into granite is not a single person task. You will get tired very quickly and are going to need to be changed out. But if you've got a few people sitting together and working, they'd likely be talking or singing to keep the rhythm and prevent it from being boring. After all, this literally was their profession, and they likely had apprentices and helpers to make sure that they could get the job done on time. Regardless of how you applied power, our copper drill bit made beautiful cores out of each of the rock types that look exactly like the ones we find in Egypt and elsewhere. And even our nice copper bit does wear out remarkably quickly. We had taken to cutting a few grooves into the face of the bit to help the grit get into the cut, and we had to recut them every 10, 15, maybe 20 minutes depending on the rock type. If you were using wood or bone instead of metal, you're going to have to keep stock replacement bits on hand ready for how quickly they're going to wear out. Speaking of which, just to demonstrate that you don't even need metal, we picked up a turkey leg from the grocery store and quickly cleaned and shaped the bone to be a drill bit. Then, just as before, we used our grit slurry and this time cut into the travertine. Sure enough, it cuts almost as fast as the copper and leaves a nice circular hole, even though the bone isn't perfectly round. This technique is so effective that it's still basically the same way that we cut glass, rock, and ceramic today. Only these days, we often use diamond-tipped bits and just keep the cutting head wet instead of having to deal with a separate cutting slurry. But the principle is exactly the same. If you're cutting hard materials like rock, this is just the best way to do it. And we know that this is how they did it for two reasons. First, at the bottom of the unfinished holes, we usually find residue of two things: copper and either corundum or quartz. And secondly, again, they left us pictures. Like, a lot of pictures. The Egyptians were some of the most aggressive documentarians in history, and recently we even identified some of the drill bits in museum collections. Though if you want a bit of ancient Egyptian documentation for yourself, don't forget to get your mummy assembly instructions after the video. Now, don't think that this technique is limited to round holes. The exact same idea can also be applied to slicing stones. If instead of a tube you use a sheet of copper or bronze, or even a slice of wood, and work it back and forth, you now have a saw that will cut even the hardest rocks. The Chinese are known to use a version of this technique, and they didn't even bother with metal at all. For cutting jade, which is one of the hardest rocks, they managed with only a bow and some string, and of course grit and slurry. We tested it, and to our shock, it does actually work. We cut into marble using just a tree branch and some string, and while yes, the string did break a lot and need constant replacement, and yes, it was slow, it did cut the marble because the copper saw, of course, was way better. But a string would be better for really deep cuts, as the cost of a long copper saw is much higher. With a copper saw, we were able to score marble in maybe 5 minutes, and then a light tap with a hammer and we now have two nice pieces. Remember, the abrasives often only need to be used to give you a breaking point. When we sliced into the side of the marble, we didn't need to go very deep before we could use a bronze chisel to give it a little whack and break off a nice chunk. And of course, once you've got your slabs or pieces cut to size, you can go at them with chisels and drills or even small abrasive stones to work them into shape. And especially don't forget little pokey tools and sticks, as well as more grinding slurry to work in the fine details. Sure, it's not going to be fast, but remember, there was no TikTok in the past. People literally had nothing better to do all day. So an extremely manual task is a great way to spend your time, especially with a group of friends, and the results are just as good as what can be achieved with modern tools, if a bit slower. Okay, we've drilled holes and we've cut slabs, but there's one last thing we need to address. One of the things you hear a lot is that the various blocks are stacked together and are so flat that you can't even fit a credit card between them. This is usually in reference to either the Egyptians or the Mesoamericans, and again is for some reason used to indicate lasers or other nonsense. Just quickly, before we flatten some stones though, I want to mention that the pyramids of Egypt and the pyramids of the Mesoamericans, while similar looking on the outside, are actually very different internally. Mesoamerican pyramids use rubble as an internal fill, with cut stones on the outside. Those stones are then often covered in plaster to allow for painting or further decoration. Also, Mesoamerican pyramids often are more like nesting dolls, in that they went through many cycles of renovation. Rulers would periodically commission the building of a bigger pyramid on top of existing ones, so really it's pyramids all the way down. And their pyramids almost always had a temple or palace on the top. If they wanted to bury a dead king in a pyramid, they had to dig into it and build a tomb as needed. In the old world, things are a bit different. Some of the pyramids are solid carved blocks of rock all the way through, though they reserved the most nicely carved stuff for the outside, and internal blocks were a little more rough. Others used mud brick or rubble for a filling. It really depended on the location, resource availability, and what you intended to do with the pyramid or structure. In Egypt, pyramids were exclusively tombs, so they had a pointy top, sometimes covered in gold, and the outside would be polished, beautiful limestone. But the Egyptians, and of course the rest of the ancient peoples, built more than pyramids. Ziggurats, temples, and palaces galore, all over the ancient world, and they all relied on the same basic building techniques. So, how did they make the perfectly fitting rocks that went on the outside of the structures? And how did they achieve those super flat surfaces that we find all over the place? In order to understand how these were made, we need to understand how you make something flat in the first place. These days, we are awash with perfectly flat objects. You can buy a hunk of granite off Amazon that is flat to within a micron or two, and with one of these as a reference, it's very easy to copy that flat